There are men in history whose legacy is defined by a single act, a single decision, or a single moment that changes the course of events forever. And then there are men whose legacy is defined by an entire system, a system so vast, so mechanized, and so brutal that it outlived them, consumed millions of lives, and left a permanent scar on the history of humanity. Theodor Eicke was one of those men. He did not simply participate in one of history's darkest chapters. He built the infrastructure for it. He wrote the rulebook. He trained the guards. He created the model that was copied across an entire continent. And then, having constructed the machinery of death, he walked away from it, put on a combat uniform, and led his men into some of the most savage battles of the Second World War. He died not in a courtroom, not in a prison cell, but in a burning aircraft over the frozen fields of the Eastern Front, shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The story of Theodor Eicke is the story of the Third Reich itself, a story of absolute ideological fanaticism, institutional evil, and a man who embodied both with complete conviction. To understand Theodor Eicke, we have to understand the world that made him. He was born in October 1892 in Hampont, a small town in the Alsace-Lorraine region, a territory that had been disputed between Germany and France for generations. Growing up in a borderland, surrounded by questions of national identity, Eicke developed an intense, almost obsessive German nationalism from a very young age. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he joined the Imperial German Army immediately, serving as a paymaster's assistant rather than a frontline infantryman. He was competent enough, but his military career was unremarkable. When the war ended in 1918 with Germany's defeat, Eicke, like so many of his generation, was devastated. He felt betrayed. He felt humiliated. And he was completely unable to adapt to civilian life. Throughout the 1920s, Eicke drifted. He worked as a police informant, then as a security guard for chemical company IG Farben. He was married, had children, struggled financially, and grew increasingly angry at the world around him. He dabbled in extreme right-wing politics, always looking for someone to blame for Germany's misfortunes. When the Nazi Party began to rise to prominence in the late 1920s, Eicke found what he had been looking for his entire life. He joined the Nazi Party in 1928 and the SS shortly after. For the first time, he felt he belonged somewhere. He threw himself into the movement with total devotion. But even within the Nazi movement, Eicke's personality caused problems. He was aggressive, insubordinate, and paranoid. He was constantly getting into conflicts with other officials. In 1932, things came to a head. Eicke was arrested by German authorities for his role in a bomb plot against political opponents. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Before he could serve his sentence, he fled to Italy, where he spent time at an SS camp for German exiles near Rome. He was not simply a loyal soldier. He was a man who operated on the very edge of what even the early Nazi movement could tolerate. What saved him, and what ultimately gave him his terrible place in history, was Heinrich Himmler. The head of the SS personally intervened to have Eicke pardoned and brought back to Germany after the Nazis came to power in 1933. Himmler saw something in this angry, fanatical man, a total willingness to do whatever was necessary without question, without hesitation, and without remorse. In the spring of 1933, just months after Hitler became chancellor, Himmler assigned Eicke to take command of a newly opened facility outside the town of Dachau in Bavaria. It was the first concentration camp of the Third Reich. What Eicke found when he arrived at Dachau was a chaotic, disorganized mess. The camp was already being used to hold political prisoners, communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other perceived enemies of the new regime. But there were no standardized procedures, no clear chain of command, and the guards were behaving erratically, engaging in random violence that was completely undisciplined. Eicke looked at this chaos and saw an opportunity. He set about building something entirely new. Within months, Eicke had transformed Dachau into the model for every concentration camp that would follow. He created a meticulous set of regulations governing every single aspect of camp life. He defined the categories of prisoner punishment, from hard labor to solitary confinement to flogging. He established a clear hierarchy of authority. He created a special uniformed guard force, which he called the Death's Head Units, named after the skull and crossbones insignia they wore on their collars. And most importantly, he cultivated a specific psychological mindset among his guards. He told them repeatedly that the men behind the wire were not human beings deserving of sympathy. They were enemies of Germany, vermin, and they were to be treated accordingly. Sentiment, he declared, was weakness. Weakness was treason. Himmler was so impressed with what Eicke had built at Dachau that in 1934 he appointed him inspector of concentration camps and commander of SS Death's Head Units. This gave Eicke authority not just over Dachau, but over every concentration camp in Germany. He immediately went to work replicating the Dachau model everywhere. Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Mauthausen, all of them were built and organized according to the Eicke system. The rules he wrote, the guard training he standardized, the culture of dehumanization he cultivated, it all spread across the entire concentration camp network. Theodor Eicke did not just run a camp. He built an empire of suffering. But before all of this expansion, Eicke was called upon for a very different kind of assignment, one that would bind him permanently to the innermost circle of the Nazi leadership. In June 1934, Adolf Hitler moved against the leadership of the SA, the brown-shirt paramilitary organization led by Ernst Röhm, in an event known as the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler had decided that Röhm, once his closest ally, had become a threat. The SS was chosen to carry out the purge, and it was Theodor Eicke who personally went to Röhm's prison cell in Stadelheim prison in Munich, placed a pistol on the table, and told the former SA chief to shoot himself. When Röhm refused, Eicke drew his own weapon and shot him dead. This act of personal loyalty to Hitler cemented Eicke's position within the SS hierarchy. He was untouchable. Whatever he wanted, whatever he needed to continue building his camp system, he received. Throughout the late 1930s, the camp network he had designed expanded dramatically as the regime intensified its persecution of Jews, political opponents, and other targeted groups. The system Eicke built was ready and waiting when the Holocaust began. But Eicke did not stay behind his desk to watch the results of his work. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, he requested a combat command. His Death's Head units were reorganized and expanded into the SS Division Totenkopf, the Death's Head Division, and Eicke was given command. He was 50 years old, had no real conventional combat experience, and was leading a division into one of the most mechanized and brutal wars in history. Most professional military commanders expected him to fail completely. Instead, Eicke proved to be a surprisingly effective combat leader. During the invasion of France in May 1940, the Death's Head Division fought ferociously, pushing through Allied lines with an aggression that impressed even regular German army generals who had initially dismissed the SS divisions as amateur soldiers. But the French campaign also produced one of the most notorious atrocities committed by German forces in the West. Near the town of Le Paradis, soldiers of the Death's Head Division captured nearly 100 British prisoners of war from the Royal Norfolk Regiment. Rather than taking them into custody, the soldiers lined them up against a barn wall and massacred them with machine guns. Eicke did not personally order the massacre, but the culture of violence and dehumanization that he had spent years building within his unit made it possible. After France, the Death's Head Division was thrown into the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was unlike anything that had come before. The Eastern Front was not a conventional war. It was a war of ideological annihilation, and the Death's Head Division was in the middle of it from the very first days. Eicke drove his men relentlessly, pushing them through the vast Russian landscapes as the Wehrmacht achieved its stunning initial successes. But the war in the East was also consuming men at a horrifying rate. By late 1941, as the German advance stalled in the brutal Russian winter, the Death's Head Division found itself in desperate defensive battles. One of the most savage came near the city of Demyansk, where Soviet forces encircled an entire German corps, including elements of the Death's Head Division, in the winter of 1941 to 1942. For months, the men in the Demyansk pocket were supplied only by air, fighting in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees against relentless Soviet assaults. Eicke was in the pocket with his men, leading from the front in a way that earned him genuine respect from the soldiers who served under him. Whatever his crimes, whatever system he had built, on the battlefield he did not hide behind his rank. He was wounded multiple times on the Eastern Front. He recovered and returned to his command each time. By 1943, the tide of the war was turning dramatically. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had destroyed an entire German army, and the Soviet Union was beginning to go on the offensive. In February 1943, during intense fighting near Kharkov in Ukraine, Eicke flew in a light reconnaissance aircraft over the front lines to observe Soviet positions. The aircraft was hit by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. It went down behind Soviet lines, crashing into the frozen ground. Theodor Eicke was killed instantly. The SS mourned him as a hero. Himmler personally attended his funeral. He was posthumously promoted and buried with full military honors. His men in the Death's Head Division erected a memorial to him on the spot where his aircraft went down. To the SS, he was a fallen warrior, a true believer who had died for the cause he had dedicated his life to. But history remembers him very differently. The concentration camp system that Theodor Eicke built did not die with him. It continued to function, continued to expand, and continued to consume lives on an incomprehensible scale until the very last days of the war. The guards he trained, the procedures he wrote, the ideology of dehumanization he spread, all of it lived on. When Allied forces began liberating the camps in 1945, what they found was the direct legacy of the system Eicke had designed in that first chaotic camp at Dachau more than a decade earlier. Theodor Eicke was never tried for his crimes. He was never forced to sit in a courtroom and answer for what he had built. He died in combat, which in the warped value system of the Third Reich was considered a good death, a soldier's death. But the judgment of history is not bound by the values of the Third Reich. Eicke built the architecture of genocide. He trained the executioners. He wrote the rulebook for a system that murdered millions. And he did all of it with absolute conviction, believing until the moment his aircraft fell from the sky that he was serving his nation and his Führer with honor. That is the story of Theodor Eicke, and now you know it.